Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. On the day America completes its withdrawal from Afghanistan, we present a perspective from Pakistan. What is the view from Islamabad? My guest today is Pakistan's former ambassador to the United States, the United Nations, the United Kingdom. And frankly, no one understands Pakistan's foreign policy better than Maleeha Lodhi. Maleeha Lodhi, Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6 in Britain, has told the British paper The Telegraph that what we've witnessed is a Pakistan invasion of Afghanistan fronted by the Taliban. In other words, without ISI funding, military assistance, logistical support, the Taliban simply could not have swept to power in Kabul so quickly. How do you respond to that view?
I think it's laughable, frankly. It's just laughable. It is so absurd. I think the important issue for us is to look at the future rather than to try to find scapegoats for what has been a debacle for Western countries. So I think, Karan, for us, it's important to see what is going to happen next in Afghanistan. After all, we are speaking to each other at a very somber moment, a decisive moment, and I would call it a moment of truth for the Taliban and the other leaders of Afghanistan.
Let me then put this to you. I'm not surprised you disagree completely with Sir Richard. How would you yourself describe the relationship between Taliban, Pakistan, and the ISI?
I think we have kept a channel open over the years with the Taliban. If we hadn't, there would have been nobody to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table at Doha, which led to the Doha Agreement between the Taliban and the United States. In fact, if the Doha Agreement itself had not taken place, the US would not have been leaving without any combat casualties for a year and a half after the Doha Agreement was signed. I think the fact also that Afghanistan did not descend into a civil war, which everyone was dreading. There were forecasts. There was apprehension all over the world, including in my country, if this channel had not been open. So I would still say, Karan, we need to look at what's going to happen next, because now that the Taliban are in power, in fact, they're in control now of the airport as well. So I would, say, let's see what happens next in Afghanistan. That surely is more consequential than the past. I mean, we can go on about the past.
Absolutely.
And dissect it.
I will definitely come to what happens next because I think that's critical. But one more question, because you will have an audience not just in India, but internationally listening to you. Do you really mean that all Pakistan did when you describe Pakistan's relationship and the ISI's relationship with Taliban is simply keep a channel open? Was there no logistical support, no military support, no...
I totally reject that. As I said, we had a channel open. We used that channel to prevent a civil war. We used that channel for positive effect. And I think, as I said to you, the United States could not have forged the agreement first under the Trump administration and then subsequently the Biden administration, as you know, stood by it. All of that only happened because we were the ones who brought the Taliban to the negotiating table.
In other words, the credit for the fact that there has been a transfer of power without a civil war, and B, that the Taliban came to the negotiating table in Doha, that credit goes to Pakistan and the channel that you kept open.
No, I think you are putting words in my mouth. All I'm saying is we played a role. That's very different from saying that we determined the outcome. We contributed to the outcome. So did others. So did multiple factors within Afghanistan itself. I think so did the Taliban, who calculated that it was in their interest to find a negotiated end to the war in terms of the foreign military presence in Afghanistan. I think for the United States too, they had an option to continue what was clearly an unedifying enterprise by them. And I think President Biden took absolutely the right decision to end what he called, rightly, America's forever war.
That isn't quite the impression that your prime minister has given in his interviews to the New York Times. He believes that the precipitate decision taken by the American president, not just to leave Afghanistan, but announce a date well in advance by when he'll have done so, created the sense of chaos that led to the Taliban sweeping through. So your view is clearly different to what Imran Khan said to the New York Times at the end of June.
My view is usually different from those in power. That's nothing new. It's not breaking news. But I think, there are two things that you have to distinguish here, Karan. One, of course, is the US decision to end the war. The other is the manner in which they left Kabul. And of course, the evacuation, which looked so chaotic. I think the prime minister himself was probably making a distinction. But I'm not here to clarify what he said. My own opinion is very much that President Biden, who held this view for a long time, as you know, under President Obama's administration when he was vice president, he always felt that the US mission should be a counterterrorism mission. It shouldn't be, nation building or counterinsurgency. So I think it's a good decision.
Tell me, how is the Taliban's triumphal entry into Kabul viewed in Pakistan? Is it seen as a moment of satisfaction because the army has now secured the strategic depth that it's always wanted? Or is there also, side by side, concern about the uncertainty, the instability, and the turmoil on the other side of the border, not to mention the fact that you could also face hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of refugees pushing through your border?
First of all, Karan, this notion of strategic depth is just completely off the wall. There is no such thing that Pakistan needs to secure. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state. Nuclear weapon states don't need physical strategic depth in any country or any neighboring country. So let me first sort of reject that notion. But I think you ask a very important question, which is, well, how is Pakistan responding? And I think, we have, a diverse array of views in Pakistan. But at the official level, there is a mixture, I think, one of relief that the much sort of feared civil war did not erupt. But there's also anxiety and apprehension about what might happen for all the reasons that you just cited. Look, this is a moment of truth for the Taliban. They face multiple challenges in Afghanistan. And Pakistan, as you know, was directly affected. We've been directly affected for 4 decades of war, strife, foreign military interventions in Afghanistan. I mean, other than Afghanistan itself, Pakistan bore the brunt of what was happening there. So instability in Afghanistan means instability in Pakistan. Our security is inextricably linked with the security of Afghanistan. So to that extent, yes, we are watching the situation very closely. I think we have played, if I may say so, we have played a critical role on 3 fronts. One, the diplomatic front, where we've been trying to nudge the Taliban towards meeting the expectations, not just ours, but of the international community. And I'll come to that in a minute. The second role that we're playing is a humanitarian role. We are trying to support the humanitarian effort, which will be much needed in Afghanistan. We've set up, for example, a humanitarian air bridge between Islamabad, Peshawar, and Mazar Sharif, and other cities. Also, we are looking at how we can create an air bridge. Now, the third critical role that we are playing, already played, is in the evacuation effort by the coalition forces and others. Over 10,000 people have been evacuated into Pakistan. And they belong to almost, I would say 28, 29 countries. We've evacuated staff, personnel from UN agencies, other multilateral organizations like the World Bank. So, it's a huge challenge for Pakistan also. And there's huge pressure also to continue to play these 3 different kinds of roles.
Tell me, how concerned are you about the impact this could have on what's called the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan? It's no secret that they've sought sanctuary in the past in Afghanistan. It's no secret that they were close to the Afghan Taliban. It's no secret that they'll be emboldened by the success of the Afghan Taliban. Does that worry you that there could be a blowback in terms of terror in your own country? Or do you take comfort from what your own internal affairs minister, Sheikh Rashid, has said, that he's got assurances from the Afghan Taliban that the TTP will be reined in?
Well, there is concern, unquestioningly. There is not just concern in Pakistan, there's concern in every neighboring state of Afghanistan about the fact that several kinds of terrorist groups reside in Afghanistan. For Pakistan, it's the TTP. For China, it is ETM. For the Russians and the Americans, and of course for us as well, it is Daesh. The Iranians have concerns about how the Taliban might treat the Shia population, who, as you know, faced atrocities in the past. So every neighboring country has a concern. As far as my country is concerned, I think what we would want the Taliban to do, the Afghan Taliban, is not just to rein in the TTP, but to make sure they stand by their promise, not just to us, but to the international community, that they will make sure that no militant or violent group that resides in Afghanistan poses a threat or attacks any other country. We would like to hold them to that promise. And to that extent, I think it's very important, and perhaps we can speak a little about that. It's very important for the international community to remain united in the way that it engages with the Taliban and ensures that there is collective pressure on the Taliban.
In that list of groups that you believe that the Taliban in Afghanistan must not give sanctuary to, you mentioned terrorist groups that are identified by all the countries in the region, but for two, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Lashkar-e-Toiba. There's no doubt that the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish are also present. Bruce Riedel has gone on record to say that there are perhaps 1,000, the Indians believe 10,000 of their cadre with the Taliban in Afghanistan. We know, but I don't want to antagonize you by saying it, that both these groups also get a lot of support from your country. But they are proscribed by the UN, and you know that because you've been ambassador at the UN. Will you also put pressure on the Taliban when they form a government not to give sanctuary to the LAT and the Jaish, two groups that matter hugely to India?
I think it's up to the international community to identify. As I said, it's important that the international community is united so that collective pressure is mounted as far as any militant group is concerned. So it will be important to see how the Taliban will deal with this. I think one indicator of the international sort of community or the unity beginning to fray somewhat came yesterday. It came when the Security Council met and adopted a resolution in which they called for several things. Some of it reiterated the previous Security Council resolution of the 16th of August, basically setting out expectations of the Taliban, but also asking for safe passage for those who wanted to leave. Now, that's of great Western concern. The draft was prepared by Western countries. It was pushed by the P3, if I can call them that. And two countries, members of the P5, abstained on the vote, Russia and China. One of the reasons that they cited, at least the Russian permanent rep cited, was that this resolution failed to name either Daesh or ETIM. Now, I cannot sort of second guess what their other concerns may have been which led them to abstain. Abstention, of course, is not so bad because at least the resolution was adopted. But why I say this, Karan, is it's important that no violent group that attacks any country has refuge in Afghanistan. I'm not in a position to name which group is where and so on. I think we have to rely on credible, independent agencies to do that. I'm not in a position to say. But some we know because they figure in UN reports.
Okay, I'm just going to repeat that sentence because I think it's very important, even though you didn't name any group, you didn't name any country. But I think intelligent people reading between the lines will understand what you said. You said it's important that no violent group that attacks any country has refuge in Afghanistan. I'm simply underlining that for the audience. Let's at this point talk not about how Pakistan views what's happened in Afghanistan, but about what's actually happening in Afghanistan itself at the moment, because I think that's also very important, and I'd like your perspective on it. Does last week's devastating bomb by ISIS and the continuing rocket attacks thereafter suggest that the situation is much more complicated and difficult than people at first realized? And secondly, that the Taliban is not in complete control of security, even in its capital, even after 2 weeks?
I think there are two factors as we look at this in order to answer your question. One, Karan, is it's too early to make any kind of a judgment whether they are in control or whether they will be in control. We will have to give them some time to come to some kind of a judgment. The second thing, I think we have to recognize that these blasts, these terrible bombings, which took so many innocent lives, they took place because security was divided in Kabul. The airport was in the control of the Americans, whereas the rest of the city was in control of the Taliban. And also, large numbers of people had congregated around and inside the airport. Now, when that happens, of course, it gives an opportunity to the men of violence to strike, and which is what happened. Because people in such large quantities provide a kind of a cover, if I can put it that way. So we have to wait and see. Now, look, when you look at the future, as you asked this question more broadly about the future, I think what the Taliban have to face is the security challenge, which you identified, of course. Daesh is there. They've been fighting Daesh. And there are other groups. They have to show that they have not only severed their links with these groups, but they're prepared to act against them. So that's the security part. The other is, of course, the huge challenge of governance. Look, they can't sort of deal with security if they don't get governance right. Then there is the humanitarian challenge. Almost 500,000 Afghans have been displaced, internally displaced. Then there's the economic challenge. And I think we have to sort of very closely watch what some Western countries will do, particularly the United States, because as you know, they've frozen some funds for the Afghan government.
Can I take those challenges up one by one? And can I begin by putting to you what Saad Hosseini, the owner of Tolo Television, which is a functioning television channel, and sometimes a very brave channel because it's been showing interviews with not just Amrullah Saleh, but also Ahmad Shah Massoud's son. He said to me last week that the ISIS attack means that Taliban is now the new Ghani and ISIS is the new Taliban. He said, in effect, this was Groundhog Day and the whole country was reliving its past all over again. To what extent is that likely to be true? Not perhaps by the situation that exists today, but if the insecurity in the Taliban and the ISIS attacks continue.
You know, I don't want to go into an analogy that he came up with. It's for him to decide the basis on which he made that analogy. I just think if you look at the future, it's not just Daesh that the Taliban have to deal with. Of course, that's a major threat because as we've seen, the US saying that if any of our interests are threatened, we will strike. I think the Taliban have to also deal with that. Although, as you know, in the initial strike, the Taliban seemed to have known about it and certainly didn't say very much. But, you know, so this is one aspect that...
Can I interrupt and ask you this?
Yes,
do you think Taliban has the military capacity and also the internal political unity to deal with ISIS? There are many who fear that the Haqqanis may be a lot more sympathetic to ISIS than, say, someone like Mullah Baradar or Stanikzai. So will internal differences in the Taliban give the ISIS the room it needs to continue?
I don't think ISIS is as powerful as, you know, the Taliban once were when they were fighting this 20-year war. So, you know, I think, again, going back to Saad's analogy, I don't think that quite holds. But again, you know, it's hard to predict how this will turn out. I am not in a position to say how the Haqqani group will, you know, behave or conduct themselves. But it is also true that one of the Haqqanis is now is part of the government's team that is reaching out to other groups to see if they will be able to join the Taliban in an inclusive government. So I think, Karan, the most important first indicator of where the Taliban are going, the first important indicator. Because, security, as I was saying to you, security doesn't sort of happen in a vacuum unless you get governance right. It's an aspect of governance.
And I'll come to governance. I'll come to governance very soon, because I think it's critically important, and it's something you've written about in the Financial Times. But one more question about the Haqqanis. You must have noticed that the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, yesterday publicly and very forcefully said that the Haqqanis and the Taliban are two separate entities. And you will remember from your time as both ambassador in America and at the UN that Mike Mullen, when he was chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly said that, in fact, the Haqqanis were just the veritable arm of the ISI. Are the Haqqanis loyal and totally committed to the Taliban? I know Sirajuddin is the deputy commander. Or are there fissures? Because one concern comes from the fact that Khalil Haqqani is said to be in charge of security in Kabul. And many people wonder that's perhaps one reason why the ISIS have been able to carry out attacks. And certainly the new acting defense minister, Mullah Zakir, is said to be close to the Haqqanis, even if not part of that group. That's why I ask, is the Haqqani group the Achilles heel or the weak point?
I think that's a question only the Taliban can answer, frankly. It's not for me to answer. And as for Mike Mullen and other people's statements, which they made in the past, well, the very people that they were making these statements about are the people that they negotiated with. So, one day you designate somebody as a terrorist and the next day you negotiate with them. So the underlying factor is that there was never a military solution to this. It always had to follow a political path and a negotiated end to the war, something that we said. And I'd like to also recall, I was ambassador in Washington when 9/11 happened. Huge, huge tragedy, and I was very much there and saw how it played out. And I can tell you our very early contacts with the Americans, we kept saying to them, find a negotiated way. War is not going to be the answer. And I think if I recall his words correctly, when President Musharraf met President Bush for the first time, he said something very similar. I don't remember the exact words, but something along the lines that, we feel that the way to get to the outcome that you want is through talking and not by fighting. Okay. And that if you have to use military force, then make sure, his words, not mine, make sure it's short and targeted.
Well, no doubt that's true. It was neither short nor was it well targeted, when in the end it lasted for 20 years. But let me now come to two other issues.
Karan, 1 second. It wasn't just something that lasted for 20 years. Look at the number of Afghans who died, who were killed in this. When we talk about Iraq, when we talk about Afghanistan, we talk in a way that dehumanizes the whole tragedy.
I didn't mean to do that. The tragedy of Afghanistan is one that I feel keenly remember. So I lived there, I studied there, I know the country well. But because time is our enemy, I want to move beyond security, which we've discussed, to a point that you made in a recent op-ed that you wrote for the British paper, the Financial Times. You said, Pakistan is playing, and I'm quoting you now, an active behind-the-scenes role in persuading the Taliban to talk to other Afghan groups and establish an inclusive government. Tell me more about that role, and tell me what sort of response you're getting. Because so far, although the Taliban has spoken to Abdullah, they've spoken to Karzai, and there are reports that they may even be talking to the Panjshiri resistance, there is no government in the offing, and the only people who've been appointed are people who are close to them. So there's talk about inclusivity, but no more concrete steps. Hence my question.
I think, Karan, we have to wait and see in the next few hours. We'll probably see or hear an announcement. I think my understanding is that the United States had asked the Taliban not to announce a new government until all their forces had left. And therefore, the Taliban waited till the 1st of September, if you like, or later on the 31st of August. But as I said before, I think this is a key test of the Taliban, a key test of whether they've actually fundamentally changed from the Taliban of the 1990s. If they can put together a government which is inclusive, that will at least give some hope that there will be peace and security in Afghanistan. As you know, Karan, because you've lived there, Afghanistan is ethnically divided and deeply divided. So therefore, the only way in which there can be lasting peace in Afghanistan is if there is a broad-based government that includes different ethnic groups as well as different political groups. So we've got to wait and see. As you know, the Taliban leaders have been engaged with Abdullah, with the former President Hamid Karzai, and others. They're also trying to reach out. Now, the Northern Alliance will be key. They've got to negotiate with the Northern Alliance so that at least there is some understanding, even if the Northern Alliance doesn't want to enter the inclusive government, but they're in a position where they do not resist but support whichever government comes.
This is a very important point you're making, because on the very day the Taliban swept into Kabul, senior leaders of the Northern Alliance flew into Islamabad to seek both Pakistan's intercession and protection. And when I say senior leaders, I'm talking of Ahmad Shah Massoud's brothers. I'm talking of top Hazara leaders like Khalili and Mohaqqiq. Is Pakistan leaning on the Taliban to involve these people as well? Because they are traditional enemies, as are Amrullah Saleh and Ahmad Shah Massoud's son. Are they leaning on the Taliban, your government, to say you must involve them?
Yes, Karan, I think the extent to which we can nudge them in that direction, and we're not the only ones. Remember, the US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, he's been saying the same thing. Others who are engaged with them. Look, at the end of the day, what is going to be important is how significant international legitimacy and international recognition is for the Taliban. So that will determine the extent to which they will listen to either Pakistan, the United States, or whoever is saying all of this. Because as I said before, look, there are three core elements of the international consensus, of which Pakistan is very much a part. And what are those three key asks, if you like, or expectations of the Taliban? One, inclusive government. Two, no attacks from Afghan soil on any country. So that's counterterrorism. And three, respect for human rights and respect for women's rights as part of that human rights issue. So, on all three, the Taliban are going to be judged. The Taliban are going to be assessed, not just by us, but by others. And, to the extent that Pakistan can, it has been nudging the Taliban to deliver on all of these three fronts.
Is this what you mean when you said in that Financial Times op-ed, international recognition is an important inducement to push the Taliban? In other words, what you're saying is the world must keep saying to the Taliban, if you want to be recognized, if you don't want to be considered a pariah, then take these steps quickly, credibly, and visibly. And until you do, we will not recognize you. Is that what you're suggesting by that sentence?
I'm not saying you should make it conditional, because that would, it's very difficult, because when you make certain asks conditional, the other side tends to sort of back off. I think to let the Taliban know, which the international community has already done. This is not something which is happening today. They've already let it be known to the Taliban that if they want international recognition and critically international economic and humanitarian support and funding, then they have to respond to not the demands, but the expectations of the international community, or you can call them demands.
But you know what you also wrote in that Financial Times op-ed? You also speculated about what would happen if the Taliban don't listen, don't hear, and don't heed. You wrote, if continuing talks between Taliban leaders and their former political foes fail, the country could plunge further into crisis, leading to serious security ramifications across the region. That is the downside of the Taliban turning a deliberate deaf ear.
Yes, absolutely. And that's also the burden of history, the lesson of history, the burden of history, whatever you want to call it. Afghanistan's history shows that if any single group tries to monopolize power, then stability is not assured. In fact, peace and stability remain elusive.
But do you think the Taliban care? I mean, after all, they have lived with instability, uncertainty, chaos, and the threat of civil war for 20 years.
That's again, Aaron, it's a question only the Taliban can answer. And I can only wait and see what their conduct is likely to be. Because to be honest, I can't speak for the Taliban, nor do I wish to speak for the Taliban.
No,
all I can do as an analyst now, as a former official, so I'm not an official, I do not speak today for the government of Pakistan, but I speak for many people in Pakistan because my views are shared by many people. And we're apprehensive. We're watching the situation and with great apprehension.
Let me put you a second problem the Taliban face. If the first is the need, I would say dire need, to quickly create an inclusive government, the second is the challenge of governance. And there, in fact, the problem could be even greater. Honestly speaking, the Taliban haven't shown any great understanding of economic development, education, health, policing, and perhaps even general administration. And once again, I'll quote Saad Mohseni, who said to me last week that if the West don't step in and help them set up these governance structures, the Taliban could convert to Khmer Rouge very, very quickly. And when I asked him, do you have killing fields in mind? And he said, yes.
I think he makes the right point about the need for international help to the Taliban. But, one of the things, one of the challenges that they're facing is so many people who used to work in the government, who had the expertise to govern, if you like, whether it's the health sector or other sectors or education sector, many have been evacuated. So, that's the brain drain that they will face just compounds the challenge for them. So sure, the jury is out. We don't know whether the Taliban will be able to govern. I think they now, unlike in the 90s, they acknowledge that they will need people. And that's why they're appealing to people to not leave the country and to help them. I mean, I read somewhere, again, I'm not sure, one never knows whether the reports are fully verified, that they allowed women workers or women officials back into one or two of the social ministries. I think it was the health ministry. That, I think, is a reflection of their acknowledgement that they need these people because they can't govern on their own. They
You're
have
absolutely
no government.
Right. The BBC and Lise Doucette reported that women had been allowed back into the health ministry after women were told not to go to any government job. They were then allowed back into the health ministry because, in fact, the Taliban realized that without those women officials, the health ministry, the hospitals, and the whole healthcare industry, such as it is, wouldn't function. But let me put to you a problem that arises straight out of the point you were making a moment ago about the brain drain and how that has possibly crippled the Taliban administration. Boris Johnson has now publicly said that unless the Taliban permit every Afghan who has documents and a right to go abroad to do so, Britain at least will not recognize the Taliban. And I imagine that could be a line that Blinken follows in America and the European Union as well. Now, Stanigzai has made noises to the effect, to the German ambassador in particular, that Afghans who have the right to go and permission to go will still be allowed to after the 31st. But when the Taliban realize that their brightest and their most talented are leaving, might they not have good reason to stop? And won't that deny the recognition they need? And won't that then make them, forgive my language, more bloody-minded?
Well, I think, Western countries, it's my personal view, they should not be putting conditions of this kind, because by doing that, they're already fracturing the international consensus. Let me just refer to a statement that the Russian ambassador made in the Security Council yesterday. One of the reasons Russia abstained was what I explained to you earlier, which is, certain violent groups were not named in the resolution. The other sort of reservation they had with this resolution, which talked about safe passage for everyone who wanted to leave, was that why are you doing this to the Afghans? Because of the fact that there'll be a brain drain and then, they will not be able to govern their country. So, I would simply say this. I can understand that there is a desire for those who worked closely with the coalition and were, in some way, they're threatened. But I think at this point in time, a large number of people leaving are also what we call economic migrants. They seek better opportunities abroad, and therefore they want to leave. But it'll just compound the challenge for the Taliban. If all these people leave and the West encourages that, I think then the West's other interest, which is to see stability in Afghanistan, frankly, it then undermines its own interest. Because don't forget what the West is already saying as well. They're also saying they want to see Afghanistan return to peace and security, because otherwise they don't want Afghanistan to descend into the kind of dark past which led to the sequence of events that culminated in security threats to not just the West, but to the international community. So I think we have to be very careful here.
We're coming to the end of this interview. Two quick last questions. The first is a sort of impression that's emerged from the interview. This is a critical moment for Afghanistan now that the Americans have withdrawn and the Taliban have to prove that they are up to the challenge. They can be inclusive, they can govern, they can get recognition without actually damaging themselves by allowing their most talented to leave. The situation could go either way. We simply don't know whether it will go in the right direction or whether it will sink down the hole. This is a moment of extreme tension because we find it difficult to predict credibly what the outcome will be.
Absolutely. I think it is a very somber moment. And for Pakistan, clearly, Pakistan is the most directly affected country. So, we know, we've already dealt with the fallout of 4 decades of war and conflict in Afghanistan. And we certainly don't want to see any more. And we wish the best for the people of Afghanistan, for the men and women of Afghanistan. Look, they need peace more than anybody else.
Absolutely.
They're the ones who are yearning for peace.
My last question, do you have any sense of when Pakistan will recognize the Taliban government?
We will only recognize the Taliban government, as far as I know, in lockstep with the rest of the international community. We would like to be along with the rest of the international community. We're not going to rush to recognition. I mean, the government hasn't been formed yet, but we are not going to rush. You remember in the 1990s, Karan, we were one of 3 countries that recognized the Taliban, and we first faced a great deal of international isolation at that time. As a result of that, we're not going to go down that path again.
But you are genuinely prepared to wait till the Americans, the British, the European Union do so? Or will you take your cue from the Chinese and the Russians instead?
But guess what? The West is not the world. The world exists beyond 4 or 5 countries in the West, much as we'd like to see, how they respond. But I think for us also, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that's a key. It's an organization of 57 countries. We will have to see. It's not something, but I can tell you that we're not going to rush into it.
Maleeha Lodhi, thank you very much for this interview. Thank you very much for giving us a perspective from Islamabad and telling us how you believe how many people in your country view the situation, what you think are the possibilities, what are the dangers, and what are in fact the threats. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Karan. May I just have the last word?
Of course.
I like this photograph right behind you of Benazir Bhutto, the late Benazir Bhutto. What a beautiful photograph this is.
Thank you very much indeed. It was during an interview she gave me in 2003 when she came here. And she was in those days technically in exile in London, but she came to attend a conference in India. And above her, in case you haven't recognized him, is David Cameron.
Yes, I did.
You're very observant.
Thank you so much.
And may I compliment you and say that the photograph behind your right shoulder is you presenting credentials to the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon.
Yes. You have good eyesight.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care, Maleeha. Look after yourself.
Thanks.
Stay well.
Thank you.